processes, which is representative of those processes, to a nonlinear cloud-based way of thinking. And rather, and I think it's probably, the need for efficiency and productivity and effectiveness and all those things that businesses like to do because they like to cut to the chase, that really force them to really curtail that movement, and compress it into, take a nonlinear way of thinking and processing and put it into a linear mode, because it made it more easy to convey to a variety of people rather than doing the hard work of going back in and changing the fundamental framework. Does that sound?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I agree. I mean, linearity is much easier to deal with, isn't it? It's a step-by-step process. It's Newtonian thinking and so forth, and that's what was the flavor. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but at that time it was the flavor.
Yeah. Okay. In looking at the Sociotechnical systems design, I posted a couple articles out there that I'm digging through in detail. The one from the Journal of Change Management really goes into deep into the history and some of the changes and where they see a resurgence in that thinking. Okay. I reached out to the lead author, and they have not done anything since, other than a series of design workshops called the Star Lab. When I look at that website, they had 2 briefs that were designed for basically pre-reading. But the whole idea was to, depending upon which year, at one point they brought a number of academics together, and then I think the following year they brought a number of CEO level people together to talk about how organizations need to be redesigned. But it was a very exclusive group, I think around 30 to 50 people total, a 2-day workshop, very typical type of workshop, which was whiteboard, a lot of storyboard collecting of ideas. They presented some of the information in kind of generalities, but I haven't really seen much come out of it per se. And that's kind of where this group of at least 2 of the 4 authors of the journal article are actively involved. That's kind of an interesting approach, but again, it really cuts off a lot of other ideas coming into the mix, and they push within some of the writing that the design has to be done within a design lab. They don't really talk about what a design lab is, other than what they did in their 2-day conference themselves. But even within what they say that the organizations should be doing as part of their governance model involves a design lab. But I don't see that as really being useful. I think it requires too much in the way of expertise that organizations won't have. And it also sets it up as an episodic event versus something that is continuously supporting the organization.
I mean, Ross, for me, that process they used was self-fulfilling.
Yeah.
I always remember I was fortunate to have Eric Trist, one of the originators of Tavistock, as one of my tutors, and at one stage, for a very short time, a mentor, and his colleagues of that time. And one of the things I liked about their approach, it was very much a blank piece of paper, and initially very qualitative. It was basically, let's look at what's happening and try and make sense. And then they went down the individual, the impact of the individual on the group, and the group on the organization was what emerged from that. And they looked at those 3 areas from different dimensions, from the holistic and individually. and going through the experiences with them in workshops, which were designed to try and make sense of things, just as the one you've described.
Mhm.
There were no rules. There were no boundaries.
Okay.
Because they wanted to reenact, if you like, or allow to happen the natural dimensions of what happens in an organization as it forms from one person to two and so on, and observe the dynamics and so forth, and then look at what happens if there are no controls. So people bring in controls, and paranoia comes in very quickly because if there are no boundaries, it creates a sense of paranoia and so on. And I'm not saying that that was the only right way of doing it, but the outcome is totally different. You get a better understanding, I suggest, than bringing in experts in certain fields who come with predetermined ideas by nature of where they come from, to try and make sense of something they're trying to contrive.
Right. Now,
And so this think tank thing, just to finish, this think tank thing is a classic outcome, because they don't know what to do next.
no, well, yeah, I know. And there's no assurance that there's even the right people at the table or the right ideas other than what they put out there for pre-reading.
Well, you see, the pre-reading in itself prejudiced the outcome.
Yeah. Okay. Let me back up to the original approach. Now, that was designed as almost like a research process. Okay. Okay. That then identified a number of learnings from that could be applied. But going forward, was that similar research process then replicated in individual organizations, or were the learnings from it brought into organizations?
Well, wasn't it based on Lewin's action learning? We learn, we implement, we learn, we implement, we learn, we implement. Wasn't that the core of the idea?
Sorry, you broke up. I didn't hear you. Sorry.
Wasn't the research based on Lewin's action research? The idea that you learn by action, praxis. But look, I skimmed their paper. I'm just
I agree.
Research in the traditional sense, we go and research something, we do a paper. Whereas my understanding of action research was that you're putting the results into a loop, into a feedback loop, and then you're letting those findings percolate through the system, and then you learn. And it's been 20 years since I read action research, so I might be wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I can give you an example. I was writing a paper today, which is the framework for a management and leadership development program for a multinational business. And I called it the Management and Leadership Development Program. And so the executives of the organization said, well, hang on a minute, we don't want managers, we want leaders. So I said, well, then you don't want a business, because leaders of the type that I think you're alluding to aren't doing things, they're just telling and pointing and things. So I said, let's have a discussion what you mean by managers and leaders. And of course, this is in Central Europe, where the boundary of a manager and a leader is defined in law.
Right, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So in the Anglo-American world, a supervisor could be called a manager and nobody would lose any hair over it. In the Central European world, you cannot, a supervisor is a blue-collar worker. It can never be a manager. And a manager could never be a supervisor, and a leader could never be a manager, and it's in their job description and so forth. And so we had a really interesting discussion. The outcome is it's called the Management and Leadership Development Program, because I said, look, we're getting into semantics here. We really are. What you want to do is make sure what needs to be done is done at the right time, in the right way, and so on, within distributed authority and decision making. And so we're not defining managers and leaders anymore. We're defining people who will do things under certain circumstances within defined boundaries of what they are allowed to do and not to do. And it was a very interesting discussion. And it sort of follows on, I think, from this whole approach to trying to have a one-size-fits-all in terms of how organizations work, as opposed to sitting down and saying, what is the social system we need as an organization to survive in this business? And how does that connect with the nature of the work that we have to do? Let's put the definitions and the job descriptions to one side. And then we start to see the world very differently. And I think this is where this whole bringing together of experts creates an environment where they're not able to do that, because each one from different countries will have a different view of what that word means in their culture. And if you go to Italy, they have special titles by law, but if you ask, is that a manager? Oh, that's the person who's responsible. They call them the responsible. And so everyone knows that's the responsible for marketing. That's the responsible for sales. It doesn't say whether they're a manager or a leader. It's about their responsibility, which is an interesting view of looking at what the nature of the work is that that person does. Then you have to define, well, what are they responsible for? And then you get into another discussion. And so I'm very wary at the moment of many of these papers that are coming out, whether it's PricewaterhouseCoopers are pretty good at it at the moment, with these grandiose schemes based on the current paradigm. And so they're trying to cure the problem with the same problem. They're just reinventing it.
What sort of grandiose schemes they
Well,
propose?
you name it. You've got hypertext organizations, you've got parallel organizations. There's a whole list of different solutions they've got to the problems. And they publish a paper about what, twice a week, Ross, on these things. I think the rate at the moment.
Yeah, some of them are like they're reinventing the matrix organization as a helix.
Yeah,
trying to split the getting the work done and the developing of people.
Yeah,
which creates a whole nother set of matrix type of problems of trying to manage people from two perspectives.
Yeah, so in other words, they keep on trying to resolve organizational design with geometry, matrices or helixes, rather than with algorithms, which is a process.
Yeah, but they're making this. They're forming their solutions within the paradigm of hierarchy.
Yeah, for sure.
They're not challenging this,
which is another form of geometry.
Yeah, and it's about control. We keep coming back to this same thing about control. I don't say that you don't need controls in organizations, but if you look at it from the other end and say, what sort of controls do we need to achieve this activity, is different to saying, how can we control this activity? It's two polar views,
Yeah.
Going back to the Journal of Change Management article,
most
of what they identify in here are things we've already talked about. They make an argument of going forward with a rethinking of social technical systems, but the rethinking really isn't clear as to what is done differently or how to do it differently, other than they bring in some of the more of the requirements that we've identified earlier of what we need without necessarily going into how to do it.
And they also bring in the networks. They bring in the networks, but then try to control the networks in a hierarchy.
Yes, I saw that.
Which doesn't make sense.
Then and then they try to do instead of doing network weaving, they do it as a design event.
Yeah. Network controlling, basically.
Right. Okay. And that creates an episodic, you need to do network weaving when you need to do it. Don't wait for the next design.
Yeah.
It also starts to build in, who's going to lead the design activity. It's almost like they're bringing in more of a consultant base to lead the effort when it's needed, which gets back to a typical annual planning approach. And
expert consultancy as well.
Yeah, and that's the problem, and that there's not enough experts to go around. But again, it is kind of an interesting viewpoint in that it is starting to turn in. At least they are bringing it forward, but even their layout though is somewhat abstract. Now they do bring in some interesting points though. If it's not just an organization, but it's an ecosystem. We've talked about that before.
Yep.
But then they overlay the social system design, the technical system design, the organization design, the ecosystem design, and you need to find a balance of all of that.
But they're designed separately.
They're designed separately, and then as an interface. And I'm thinking, how do you design it separately?
Well, that's what worries me, because they've got experts in each of those areas. So they come up with an expert's design. And as anyone who's dealt with processes know that when the experts go in a room and you see the grey smoke, you know that they're going to come out with a process that nobody even recognizes, because it is the expert's process, not the reality of the organization. And so this is the danger of that type of approach. But what was helpful in revisiting that article, helpful for me anyway, looking at what we've been discussing in terms of the purpose alignment team, it made me challenge some of my views on how that would work.
Okay.
And so that made the article for me worth revisiting, even though I must admit I got a bit frustrated reading some parts of it. But it made me start to rethink in terms of purpose alignment. What do we really need in that team in order for it to be effective? And so I've started to give it some thought. It's not, my thoughts aren't complete yet, but it is also a risk that the type of people we need there, by definition, in some organizations like the ones I typically work with, which are industrialized, they're sort of the highest level of engineering and so forth, right on the cusp of breaking innovations and things. And so you need real experts in these fields who understand both their specialisms and increasingly the holistic side of what they do. And so the challenge for me is, how do we reduce the propensity of experts to see things too narrowly, given their role for the whole organization's optimization? And that's what I'm working on at the moment. And with the organization I'm working at the moment, it's a wonderful laboratory, because I sort of work with them individually and together, and they behave totally differently, which we expect on an individual level, but we shouldn't have from an organizational level.
It's just to be a bit of a prick here. Is a purpose alignment team a little bit like the Catholic Church and Vatican, where purpose then becomes ensconced into the heads of a few individuals, which then drive the culture and thereby ossify it and turn it into something which exists in their heads and which is not organic and emergent?
No, because I would argue that, there's a risk of that. In any time you get a group of people together, we know that from social systems, and then you get groupthink and all the other stuff, but their role is actually quite diverse, and one of them is to do something that most senior managers don't do at the moment because they are too busy in the day-to-day business. And that is to get out in the industry and see and project what they need to do differently,
Right.
and what that means for their business. And I think if we talk about the auto industry, because I think there's such a good business case, there was the situation, and I'll use Europe, where the major drivers of the auto industry were stuck on the internal combustion engine. One of them, Renault, 8 years ago said we're no longer going to be involved in the design of internal combustion engines. We're going to focus on e-mobility. And everyone laughed at them in the industry. Then when the penny dropped that maybe the rest of us should get involved in e-mobility, they used their old mindsets to design what they thought was a very good product. What they didn't do was get out and see what was happening with those who'd already started, such as Tesla and a few in China. Had they done that, they would have come up with something totally different. And now they're really struggling. And the only company in Europe that is actually has increased its sales during the pandemic is BMW, because they did listen. They weren't good at responding, but they did listen.
Yeah. So what it is, it's about really exploring the external environment and taking information from the external environment, bringing it back into the organization. The organization makes sense of it.
Yeah, and challenging what they're doing and the assumptions they're making and their business model. And there's one company in Austria that is very good at this. And they've gone from a laggard in e-mobility. They were the world's leader and still are in the internal combustion engine design, particularly diesel, which was the modern diesel was actually designed in 1952 by the owner's father when he was alive. They really rejected the whole idea of e-mobility, but their business model is such that they are now one of the leaders in all of the areas around e-mobility. And so they are always scanning the environment, and they have an owner, one person owns it. It's a large number of people worldwide. And he is on every influencing panel in Europe in terms of transport. So he defines his own products by getting the legislation passed that he needs to sell his products.
Yeah.
And that's what I mean about the purpose alignment team. That's part of their job, is getting out there, making it change.
Yeah, enormously important. So it's like it's a sensor. It's like if the human being was an organization, it'd be like our eyes and ears. It's sensing the environment, it's seeing what's happening, it's looking for perturbations and irregularities, and bringing those irregularities back into the organization to try to say, I think there's some change coming. Yeah. So it's a teleological function.
Okay.
Yeah, and this is why I'm experimenting with it with this company. I'm very fortunate. The CEO, or the European CEO, he is very, very sensitive to the need to change and these new ways. And it is not easy because it's a multi-cultural in the sense that the whole company is from many different countries with a very difficult mother company who have very fixed ways of doing things. But he's protecting the European side from that so that we can show the impact in Europe, and then the US, because the US are also now plugged in and are watching and listening to it.
So how does this experimental prototypal purpose alignment team interface with the rest of the business? At what level?
Well, there is only the only levels they have are the executives and the directors. The rest are all operational. The directors are forming the purpose alignment team. They are all real experts in their field.
So where does the external focus come from?
They go out. They go out.
Right.
They go out. They're traveling all the time, and even with COVID, where they can, they travel to the customers, the politicians, the industry. So, for example, if you're building the casings for batteries in e-mobility, they come under horrendous pressures and temperatures. So you have to be very, very careful of the materials that you use. And at the moment, they are very specific alloys, but they're actually out there talking to people who are in alternative materials to say, well, what is the future and what's the impact of that we can use in our business that will put us ahead of others. So this is now, after a lot of encouragement, I mean, this didn't happen overnight. I've encouraged them to give up all their line management, which they have, and they're now focusing now on the optimization by distributed authority and decision making. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So once you get, but the key is getting rid of the line management, because once
and the PayPal example you gave is still got line management. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was the key. So that's the key. You've got to break it, otherwise you're going to get these bloody directors pontificating.
Yeah.
I agree with you as someone who's worked for the Catholic Church for 25 years and diocesan level. You don't know how true that is.
Absolutely.
Sorry.
No. You're absolutely right. The extent to which the Catholic Church is functional at all is because there is a whole heck of it's bigger than the structures that it has. And it can't help but have this component that's self-organizing. And so there's this tension between this control and this self-organizing complex adaptive system. And part of my struggle with this is how do you build the language and the paradigms to get these people to see, no, you don't have control. But you can facilitate this process, and you can, and you can inspire it, and you can get it working in a way that's actually functional. One of the concepts that I've been reading recently, Nassim Nicholas Taleb's book Anti-Fragile.
I'm sorry to hear that.
And I think that has that has a lot of the concepts that can work at breaking this idea of control. I mean, he made the case in the Black Swan that you really don't have control over a lot of things that encourage it, but you take on fragility by the illusion of control. And I think what's at the heart of the question is, how do you break that illusion of control such that people can feel like, aha, there's a better way if I just let go. And I think that's kind of at the crux of the matter.
Well, I can tell you the process I've used so far. It's taken many hours, long nights with people, not on the individual basis, but collectively. So bringing all of the top people together and helping them look at, if you distribute authority and decision making, let's start on the basis that your people, whenever they need to make a decision, can make one, full stop. You devolve and distribute everything. And then say, right, now which decisions are critical to the survival of the business? And then we look at, where should these be made and how should they be made? Not who should make them. And then you start to look at the principles that are there upon which people will act and react. And some decisions you need because of law, legal issues, contractual issues that only certain people are allowed to change or finalize the agreements. And so you have set processes for these, because we've done away with all the processes for the non-technical world. You need them in the technical world. And so then you say, right, these are the legal things. In terms of the other decisions, which ones are we nervous about that we would normally want to control? And then how can we give those away? What do we need to feel comfortable? And basically it's information, and it's the comfort of knowing that people are going to do the right thing. And so you then start to create the principles, the sub-principles and guidelines outside, put the processes to one side because they're very, very few. And you make sure that there is an information system so that people who are making decisions have access to the information they need. And then the biggest challenge of all, particularly in Central Europe, how do we encourage people to make decisions when it's not in their job description? How do we help them to feel that they have to take responsibility for what they are doing and saying, because that's not in their job descriptions and the works councils will not allow it, and so on. And that's where we're at the moment. And in the middle of February, I start a program, which is a 6-month each group of people in positions where decisions will be made. They are on a 6-month program with certain workshops spaced over the 6 months, where they will learn through doing and being supported and coached on what that means for them at work and in their organization. So it's no theory, it's not an MBA, it's not a management training course. It's about how am I going to be effective in this organization with the authority and responsibility I've now got. And then the managers, the senior people, they start to feel more comfortable. Now, it doesn't happen overnight. And so this is why I've started in one country with 6,000 people. So it's a small part of the overall organization. And yeah, it's a very different mindset and way of working.
Any other questions or comments from others?
Yeah, it sounds like a similar approach. I approach it through the lens of mechanism design, reverse game theory. So at whatever team level, whatever organizational level or structure level. So it's a very similar thing to the idea of getting rid of what Reg said, what can we do to devolve the decision making? So basically, it's exploring all the decisions that need to be made and coming up with what I call a mechanism. And it's not so much principles based. It's more if this happens, then do this. This is your budgetary sign off. We're going to increase those. These are the design of mechanisms. If there's a conflict, what do we do? If there's a problem, what do? We create a clear escalation procedure. But it's an interesting. So if anyone know what mechanism design is, have you ever heard of this concept? It comes from macroeconomics.
Yep.
Yeah, and it's just a really interesting frame, I think, to look at distributed decision making through.
Yes.
How does that bring in the mechanistic design? I hear it and I think of something that's maybe there might be an inorganic element of it. How do you bring in that kind of living system element into mechanistic design?
Yeah, so it's not mechanistic design. So and unfortunately we just inherited the language, so we're sort of stuck with it. So it comes from it's called reverse game theory, and it's about trying to align the incentives of of multiple people who've got different incentive structures. So I'll give you a really simple example, right? You're having a birthday cake, right? And now, if it's my birthday and you give me the cake and you let me cut the cake up, and if I'm greedy, I might cut myself a bigger piece, right? But what happens if I cut the cake up, but I let you, Julie, hand the pieces out? Then there's no incentive for me in order to cut a bigger slice for myself. So the incentive there is to have pretty much an equal piece. So that's just a really small example of actually how do you align incentives. And it goes into Nash equilibrium, all sorts of mathematical concepts. But it's just, I've just found it a really, really useful framework to look at how do you actually practically distribute decisions in an organization.
I can understand that would seduce many engineering mindsets because they're always looking for solutions. My approach is to try and get a similar outcome, but in a very, very different way. I would look at the cake and say to them, well, when you cut it, think about the implications of what you're doing and what the outcomes are, not just for yourself, but for others.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
I'm a narcissist. I don't give a fuck about your bloody piece of cake. So now what? Now what do you do, Red? What do you do when you get a bad actor?
I don't mind that. I don't mind that because there are implications and outcomes. And so they have to live with the outcomes of their decision.
Yeah, so someone's pissed off and I'm taking a bigger bit of cake. I don't care. I'm a narcissist. I don't care. Suck eggs.
No, yeah, you see, what that means is there is no real trust in people and the honesty of people. Because I find that if you give people the trust, they seldom disappoint, very seldom. But if we put them into a situation that they feel constrained, then they will find ways of breaking that constraint. And they're just different views. I'm not saying one's right or wrong, but my experience is that it becomes more natural for them and less process driven. And so when we look at the Eric Trist and Tavistock and all the others, when we come from that approach, which is about people and treating them as people, then yeah, I think you're giving them the freedom and they value that freedom, and therefore they seldom let you down. There are always going to be some who will, just as there are some who will break all the process rules. You can't legislate for those minorities, which is what governments try to do and create bigger problems than they started with.
So you started when you sort of said that you think that socio-technical design is really important to understand organizational development.
Yeah.
Why? Is that because, you know, I mean, from the only bit of paper I read, it was about involving people in decisions was about technologies. Don't just assume that here's a technology and plug people into it. Well, is that the key insight?
No, the key part of where they start and all the modern cognitive psychology and the brain scanning and everything is just showing them to be so having so much foresight in the work that they did. And it's basically understanding the natural process of people. We are all by definition actually quite brutal. We are quite
you just argue for mechanism design there, by the way, but anyway.
Not really.
I'm joking.
I mean, we're violent within us. That's the natural thing about people. We're naturally violent. We learn how to manage that violence as we manage to learn other things about behavior. But there are certain things that are innate within us. And if the innate properties are not understood, then it doesn't matter how many mechanisms we bring into place within organizations or within society, they will actually have pretty much an opposite effect on the way we behave. We also have this strange behavioral trait that if we are given a particular task, we behave in the way we think is appropriate for that task. And we pick that up from those around us, whether it's from the media, immediate people, or whatever. And so we take on that role in what we believe that role should be. And so jailers become violent jailers. Prisoners become a particular type of behavior associated with prisoners, and so on.
Stanford's experiment.
Well, Stanford is a good example of that in how quickly it escalates. But if you also go into the ethnic experiments with blue and red and blue people and pink people and all that sort of stuff, it just reinforces how primitive we are. And so the more we understand that, the more likely we are able to work with each other in a way that reduces those innate dysfunctions. And in organizational terms, motivation. So much work was done on motivation theories that it ended up with organizations using them to get compliance, not motivation. And there's not a performance management system that I've ever seen in an organization which is not about compliance. It's not about motivation. It's not about people doing it because they want to do it. And so there are many areas we bring in this concept of guilt into the Western world, which didn't exist in the Mayan world and times like this. And then we create a whole industry around the term of guilt and stuff like that. We're very good at trying to control people in different ways, and surprised when we burst out of that because we don't want to be controlled in that way. We want to do things differently. We all have different values and different belief systems. And so that's what the OD is about. It's sitting down with people in an organization and helping them make sense of the natural biology that they have and they're surrounded by. And how can we coexist? What do we need to do with each other? And how do we need to behave in order to achieve what we're trying to achieve?
It's beautifully framed.
Yeah, and we know from the most successful organizations, depending on how you determine success, but where you have low staff turnover, where you have profitability of the organization that goes with it, and where you have people who are applying to go to that company so they don't have to look for resources, they are applying these techniques of the classic OD and the Eric Trist approach. And there's a whole list of them that I can give you. So I think that they must have got something right. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah.
I think the question for me becomes, okay, and I remember this, even in our own organization, going back to the 90s and looking at a lot of the thinking, the social thinking that was going on at the time, and why that didn't take hold, given even the true believers, what happened and why did it fade? And do you think it was more that there wasn't, like a pedagogy or a curriculum behind it to really support it at a practical level? Because, I think even thinking back at, some of my bosses who were really big into like Edgar Schein and, and all of them, getting that transferred to your people and that mindset and getting those self-organizing systems going and all, it's a tough task. And it's kind of similar to in education, this idea of constructivism, that if you want a child to learn, or even an adult to learn, you want to start with what their mindsets are, and then kind of build into that. And my hunch is that some of these things maybe kind of moved beyond the point, or kind of moved to the wayside, because the practical systems at a very, very basic level wasn't there. The theory was there, but then you go down a level to the people who actually have to implement it. And Jen, you could probably speak to this from an HR point of view. How do you build that up to people who don't have a PhD, and who people who I don't know. Anyway.
I mean, there are so many answers there. If you go back to the 90s, it was also the beginning of the re-emergence of shareholder dominance. In the US, you'd got rid of it for some time when you broke up the big organizations that were controlling everything in the industries around them. And the same in Europe a little bit later. And then in the 90s, you started to get, again, this focus on shareholder value. And so shareholder value doesn't care about how you get there, just as long as you get there. And so we go back into this mindset that people are just a means there, and we have this human resource management, people as resources, for goodness sake, which is a consumable. Basically, a resource is a consumable. And so we start to have this mindset in organizations that the people running them were only measured in a period of 4 to 5 years on how much they got to the shareholders. And if they wanted a second tenure, which was not normal, 10 years, it was really the maximum, but most were 4.5 years, then they would drive everything through that route. And then in 1984, you have this guy said, look, we can align people with the strategy of the organization. This is how you do it. And so then the problems really took off in the 90s, and engagement of people dropped off the cliff, and still has to this day. And I think the current figure is about 15% engaged. And so there was no incentive to have this mindset. It was driven by money, basically.
Yeah. And I think the incentive now, as we see more technical and social media systems working in organizations, databases, IT systems, is that in a purely hierarchical system, those systems will not work, because you have to they become non-functional, because they have to develop to describe the natural order of how work actually gets done, and that can't be done from a top-down point of view. Technology, in many cases, if you want to know how well a company is doing, technology is the mirror for how that is. Look at their internal network structure, look at their websites and how it's organized. Look at their databases. Is it constructed? Are they working? Are they doing what they need to do? Are they getting self-service analytics out there? And if you do that, you'll see where the fragmentation lies, and where those hierarchical structures come in there and work well, and where the networks where they work well and where they don't. But I do have to leave in about 5 minutes. We have a full staff meeting that I have to go to. I would be curious to hear from Jen about, when you're hearing this theoretical talk, and you're in HR, right?
I have experience in HR, but it's not solely my work experience. But yes, and a lot of theory actually in HR, but I do have some thoughts. I think that a lot of organizations are so reliant on training, and that's where a lot of the breakdown. What excites me about the new processes is getting the people who are using the systems involved in the co-creation of the processes. And I think once we start to allow creation from the people that are using it, I think that they'll feel more in control. And once they're involved in that process, I think as Reg is talking, people will feel less like breaking out of anything and rebelling against change. And so those are really my thoughts around that. But I've always thought if you go and talk to the people who are most impacted by things like change, that's more effective than just sending out memos and communications and training people and assuming that they don't want to comply because they don't understand, instead of getting them involved in the process. That's really, I don't know if that answered any of your questions.
No, it did. It did.
I think we have to be careful when we look at the technology in organizations. The emerging research on this shows the better the communication IT, the worse the organization is, because the managers now think they understand the business and want to control it, and the workforce can escalate their decisions much easier. So we have this middle blockage again. And also the so-called genii with the social media and all the technology, your Googles and all the other major organizations, if you actually look at how often they're at court because of the way they treat their staff, they are the world's leaders in those areas as well. And their people are very fed up with all of the bullying and the gender issues and so forth. So I don't think technology is the answer. It's a human thing.
Yes, I agree. The extent to which technical systems are designed, through a top-down hierarchical structure is the extent to which they become non-functional.
Yep.
They're inorganic. And I do have to step off right now, but I hope to see you next week.
Okay, look forward to it.
All right. Thanks.
We're almost
Sorry, I didn't
cyborg.
get to meet you, Adriana. Right.
We're almost cyborgs now, Reg. We're effectively plugged into technology, almost 24/7. If you've got sleep apps monitoring your sleep, and when I say we're plugged into technology, it's our cognitive processes are constantly plugged into the technology. There's very little difference between the socio-technical systems. It's one system. It's not, there's no use even having the word socio-technical anymore, because it's one system. We are so embedded with technology, and technology is so embedded with us. It's very difficult to differentiate between where the human stops and the technology starts now.
And the question for me is, what stops us differentiating? In Central Europe now, they have started. There are many companies now that it's not allowed to contact any employee outside of working hours by any social technology or any other form of technology. They are encouraging more and more of this break in using of technology in organizations. And so, again, the technology side would love us all to use this and become technical people. And I'm not anti-technology, don't get me wrong. People used to laugh at me when they saw all my Apple stuff and all the other stuff. And I'm always programming and all sorts, and teach on a cloud computing engineering course. So I'm not anti-technology. What I am, though, I don't want the tail to wag the dog. And that's where we have been in technology for so long. Is now, and the young people, interestingly, the undergraduates today, they use technology as a tool and they switch off now. It's quite interesting. In the last 3 years, the seismic shift I've found with young people, because I survey them every beginning of every semester when a new group come in, I do all sorts of surveys with them to see how they use technology and so forth. 5 years ago, they were all designer-led. Everything had to be designers. they had to use the latest technology and so on. Today, they have no wish to buy designer gear. They don't even own computers. Most of them just use their phone for everything. They switch it off more often. And they've found this strange thing called coffee shops where they can socialize. So it is changing.
That's really encouraging, actually. It's really encouraging. It's good to hear, actually. I thought that it would just keep going down the slippery slope. I thought it would just keep going.
Well, I think the difference is these people were born with technology around them, and they are using it as a tool, as opposed to, I think the previous generations were driven by the marketing of the latest gizmos. And so I find it quite refreshing when a student comes along and says, look, we can use virtual reality for this. Now, we've got to be careful here, though, of its side effects. And these are 21-year-old students. Yeah, I would never have got that 2 or 3 years ago. Never.
Yeah, okay, that's really good to hear, because my original comment was around like how so many of society's thought processes are driven by Facebook algorithms, and whatever news feeds are shoved into their face because they're on Facebook 24/7, and that's where the comment came from.
Yeah.
And of course it happens at work as well. You're on the internal chat, and so in some ways the technology mediates the collective thought process and the collective computational process as an organization, and it's very difficult to get away from that.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that's interesting is social influencers are beginning to have less influence. That's taken a long time, but COVID has helped here because people are realizing that they're not globe-trotting, they're just putting different backgrounds on with different clothes and making a fortune out of the gullible. And when people are realizing this, and so more and more are switching them off. And I think this is really a beginning of a seismic change in technology and people.
Oh, I so hope so. So our bullshit radar's got better with the technology, hasn't it? we can see these influences are fake. Okay, that's great. That's really good.
I have a question about the Pasmore article. It was really about a concept. When they were referring to cyber leadership or platform leadership, what are they referring to there? Anybody?
Yep.
I don't know what you're talking about.
The platform leadership is probably where you get into the ecosystem concept of, it's not just one company operating in isolation, but it is several companies operating collectively to build a new ecosystem. And this is where you get into the question of what is an organization and what are the boundaries, because the boundaries are almost artificial relative to legal or contractual arrangements. But the key is on the platform itself of who's taken the leadership on putting the platform together, how that platform operates, who's allowed to operate on it, things like that.
Okay.
So for example,
if you're talking about it in relation to dispersed leadership, so, and I guess I'm trying to conceptualize what that would look like in an organization, or what it could, since we're removing line management. I mean, if a team has questions that they're struggling with, can they reach out to anyone on the team who they connect with, or for guidance? Is that kind of the thought process here?
Yeah, it gets into the guidelines used for making decisions. Reg talked about it, I think, before you joined, of of who's involved, who needs to be, I should say, not what knowledge and interests need to be involved, and not necessarily who is involved, but which roles or parts of the organization need to be involved. This gets into a number of issues of who's impacted, what parts of the organization are impacted, in what ways are they impacted, to what extent do you involve them, to inform them or consult with them, or to actually involve with them from a consensus or a consent basis. These are decision-making rules relative to how to make decisions.
What about the informal? what if a team or a team member connects with one member of the organization and isn't necessarily within their role, but they feel more comfortable going to them more as a mentor, or, you know, is that sort of thing encouraged? I know that that wouldn't be part of like a process, but I don't know. I kind of think since we set up informal networks all the time, that would, you know, still exist.
Yeah, this gets into the concept of a network of networks. It's not a single network. People are involved in multiple networks, not only from a role basis, but also from their previous, work and experiences. And to the extent that they exist, people will use them.
They're
And we
also
should be recruiting those networks.
Absolutely, we should encourage that, because collaboration isn't at one level. It's across informal networks, formal networks. What's the word I'm looking for now? The group of the same technology. I don't know what they call them. Ross, you know, what's it called?
You're talking communities of practice?
Yeah,
or?
communities of practice is a network in itself.
Right.
Yeah, and so all of these all these networks we bring together, and one of the problems that we have currently in most organizations is this notion that if you're an expert in this function, nobody else could get involved in that. And so the informal network was a little bit of a way of getting into it. The other side of the coin is that if you've got people who are on production, who in industrial organizations are seen as the lowest level, they're just there to make sure the machines work, and so you get into blue collar worker mainly, with maybe one or two white collar in the historical way of running these industries. And yet if you talk to these people on the production line, their community of practice, their friends that they drink in the pub with, are the people who are telling about the latest technology and how wonderful that is, and they know long before their managers even think about it. And so we want to encourage these people to bring this back in. Yeah.
So you recruit those networks. You absolutely tie into them. You work out which is your network weaving concept.
Yeah, and that's in all functions of the organization. It's not just the job of certain people. You get these again, these separate silos who are the experts going out doing industrial analysis and all this sort of stuff. They're the last people I would want my organization to send out to find new ways of doing things.
Yeah. The idea of these multiple networks and multiple reasons for networking, and also gets into, I guess it ties back to what could be called strategic slack, or the fitness landscape from a complexity standpoint of the capabilities that you have as an organization that may not be needed until the time when they're needed. And by encouraging those relationships, you're establishing additional lines of communication, more knowledge coming in that may not be needed, but all of a sudden it suddenly is needed. And that gives you a step forward that you would not have otherwise had without those connections being previously in place.
What I appreciate about the concept is that last night it dawned on me that it really seems to be an organization driven by passion. So that if you're interested in a certain topic, you don't necessarily have to stay with what you've done in the past. You have the opportunity to grow and learn, gain knowledge, and become an expert in something completely different. So I think that there's a lot of us out there that really are interested in a variety of topics. And I forget, there's a term now, and I watched a YouTube of where you can be experts in many different fields. But this type of organization seems to encourage that. Is that an accurate assumption, or am I kind of thinking way out there?
We don't actually have to be an expert. So very often people say, well, we can't predict the future. Actually, you can, in many industries, control the future, because there are certain things that you know are going to happen, and they will happen whatever. We know that computing power is going to exponentially increase and get cheaper and all these sorts of things. There are many things that we can say are going to happen. We also may usually get at least 2 years, sometimes 3 years notice about laws that are going to change, because they go through a long process to come into fruition, and then you have a lead time. So there are many, many things we know are going to happen. Now we can wait until someone pushes the button and that new thing happens, or we can say, well, hang on a minute, what do we want to get out of that future thing that we know is going to happen? And I often give an example of one of my students who knew that there would be a new law in Austria, and that new law was going to come in, phased in over 3 years, and it would come into being in 2 years' time. And he looked at that and thought, wow, that's a business opportunity. And basically the law was that everybody who has a turnover of a very small amount must give a written receipt for every transaction. Basically, it was to get away from these cash transactions that aren't recorded and so on. Whether you were a medical doctor in your own private practice or someone who's a street trader, you all had to have these receipts. So he, being a techie, sat down with his colleague and they designed these printers and the software and everything. And they did it very, very quickly. And they went around knocking on doors saying, hey, this new law's coming in. We can help you overcome that at this. His business just took off. The big companies in this type of business woke up 2 years later, and he had 80% of the market in Austria already. They then bought him out, and he's now working on his next predicted idea as a multimillionaire. And so we can do this, but organizations aren't looking in this way. And the people who know that these things are happening are throughout your organization. They're not necessarily managers somewhere in some specialist function. And we're not capitalizing on the resources. I think maybe you can remember, Ross, there was a survey done where they identified that most HRs do not know the capability of the organization. They know people who have roles, but they don't know what those people are capable of doing. And so when they get something that needs to be done, they start recruiting and hunting for people. And they already have the resources by the bucket load in the organization, and they lose. And I think my memory is maybe wrong here, but I think it was something like the equivalent of about 4 months of work lost in work days because of this problem, even in a medium organization, and the cost involved in that. And so this whole approach to how we look at people and what they do, we just got to start thinking differently. Yeah.
And the challenge is some of the tech companies have tried to fill that gap with a kind of an HR system that identifies competencies. The problem is that they're identifying past competencies with an inability to identify future competencies.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So when they finally need to look for future competencies, they're not in there because they never collected them before.
Well, it's interesting as a comp analyst. I mean, part of the role was to write down job descriptions, and then for FLSA, which is to determine, then I would go out and I would get to actually shadow people. And that was my favorite part of the job, because then you got to really understand their personalities, the complexities of the jobs. But that was really, I think I was probably the only, person in that capacity to really get out and say, okay, what is it that you're actually doing? What is your day-to-day involved? And so I think that's the challenge, is because HR is not part of that process. And I think that's why, and we're in HR, in my roles, I was concerned with working with the survey companies and cleaning the data. So I was in my little world, but part of my job asked me to go out. So I think to your point, it's because HR isn't integrated into the organization that how would they know?
Well, I think, let me
How would
challenge what you were doing, Jen, okay? Let me
Okay,
just
yeah.
challenge that.
Please do.
When you were going out there, were you looking at what they do, or what were you looking for?
I had a checklist and I was determining whether it qualified as a salaried individual or as non-salaried.
So is what they did in activity based, yeah?
Yes.
What about the outcome and the skills that they were using to achieve the outcome, which is a more
No.
mental and behavioral thing,
Right.
and an assumed knowledge? And
No.
of course, these aren't measured, and
Right.
yet they are the keys to what we need for the future of work.
Right.
Yeah.
And also how their job interacts in the organization too, how it impacts other jobs, if you will, that I think of a network, because they aren't they're interdependent to produce outcomes. So, and those aren't necessarily looked at either. No, what I brought into it is just my national curiosity. I was curious about people's stories and how they got into this role. And it was so fun just to see what their lives were like in this role and to see the variety of, like one of my favorite was I got to go to, it was an airline pilot. And so I got to go to the corporation's private airport and I got a tour of the private jet. In hindsight, I'm like, why do they need private jets to travel? But that was a lot of fun, and just to get to know.
Great.
So that's where I enjoyed, and but having that curiosity element.
Yeah. Going back to an earlier comment that Reg made about all of the labor law that's unique to Europe. In this case, this was labor law unique to US relative to hourly versus salaried and whether you have to pay them overtime or not. This gets into a classification system. And it's kind of funny. I was years and years ago, I was hired in as salaried. Then the Department of Labor came in, did one of these studies and decided that the job I was hired into was not salaried, but hourly. So like 5-6 years later, I ended up getting some overtime pay because they reclassified the job earlier and somehow they figured out how much overtime. I have no idea how they did that.
Calculations.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they made some estimate.
More money for you.
Yeah. It's all of a sudden, it was kind of like a mixed blessing of getting more money, but at the same time being demoted.
Yeah.
But then you get into the classic HR syndrome where everything is on this horizontal plane. Okay, so you've got your hourly workers here and they're being paid overtime. And then they get promoted to the next level, which is salaried, and they get less income for doing more responsibility and longer hours. Because where they join in, they have to be at the lower end of the scale because they're not all interconnected. Yeah. And the whole thing just is not designed to engage people, and it's not designed to get the work done. Yeah, the whole thing is ridiculous, absolutely crazy.
Well, and it actually encourages people not to expand. So especially when the leadership roles are salaried and underneath them are hourly, and the people who are hourly, who are making overtime, are making exponentially more than the leadership roles. Plus, if they're in a union, they have security. So going to leadership roles is stepping out into uncertainty, and especially if they've seen the leadership roles be laid off before. So it keeps people stagnant. So
absolutely.
My question in this conversation is, okay, so you have an organization. How do you then, because you can't have individuals determining if they're salary or hourly. That's
why not?
Because you have to take classes and be certified to be able to determine that. I mean, I'm sure they could. It's not that hard. But then how do you know
hang on,
that?
no, let's stop for a second.
Okay.
If you've got 10 people who have to create an outcome and they get a lump sum of money for doing it, who decides who gets what?
Well, they would have to.
Yeah. So
Have to.
why do we have this whole banding? I think it's a remnant of history. I'm not against trade unions. I think they did a tremendous job. The difficulty is they haven't moved forward. They're still stuck in this paradigm of theirs of controlling what can or cannot be done by the owners and the managers of organizations. And they have a very different opportunity to look at the welfare of people and help people get the best from their job rather than constrain them through outdated approaches from history. And again, we have this battle in Europe where if you're a certain size company, you have to ask the workforce if they want to be unionized. And so the management tried to reduce this opportunity by trying to persuade people not to, and say, well, if you do, you could actually be worse off. And so we have this tension in Central Europe about the dysfunction of trade unionism and the success of businesses. And it's no accident that the small businesses currently are by far the most successful because they have that flexibility. I mean, the workers' councils are draconian in their approach, really draconian. And they act like a police force in Europe. And they're supported by literally the employment police, and there is such a thing in Central Europe. It is like the tax police, but they do employment. And so if you're a big organization and you bring people from another country to train them, the employment police come along and check that they are sitting in class to make sure they're not actually doing any work.
When you say Central Europe, which countries are you talking about?
Austria, Hungary, Germany, Netherlands. Yeah, yeah.
Wow. I would have thought, maybe, Slovenia or something, but not, wow, I had no idea.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Austria is like Germany. It's a mini version of Germany. They do things slightly differently. The mentality in Austria is if it's not forbidden, it's allowed. In Germany, unless it's actually explicitly shown to be allowed, it's not allowed. So they have a different approach, but it's the same problem overall. The Netherlands is probably the most restrictive place to, next to France. There's a big battle between the two in terms of employment. I mean, if you own the company in France, you cannot go into your own company on a Saturday afternoon or Sunday without the local mayor and the trade union's permission.
Good grief.
Yeah. Don't underestimate the restrictions.
I'm staying away from Central Europe clients.
And this is, again, coming back to the earlier conversation, Ross, where in the 90s, to make the changes from the socialization of work approach would be very, very difficult in these environments because they're so controlled. And it's still challenging, really is challenging.
Yeah, Reg and I have had many conversations relative to how to move some of these ideas forward within the constraints that antiquated laws have in place that were built for the industrial era that are now trying to be shoehorned into the knowledge era. And a lot of times they just don't fit well, but they're still there. And even the people who are capable of changing them are unwilling because they're still living in the old ways of thinking.
I mean, Frederick Laloux, when he published his book about the different ways of approaching organizations, he mentioned a couple of cases in Germany, for example. And when I actually went and discussed it with him when I traveled to the UK at one of his book launches and had a meeting with him to discuss his research. And I said, how did they manage to achieve these different approaches in Germany? And his research wasn't that good, actually, and he couldn't go into detail. So what I subsequently found out was that those organizations that changed have a shadow organization. They have the one they show the legislators and the trade unions and everybody, with the wiring charts and everything in hierarchy. And behind it was the true flexible operations. And what they did is when they had a statistical question or some other legal thing come in to a role that didn't exist, it was picked up by someone who was given that title on the paper, and then collectively they answered it. And so I've learned from that. And that's exactly what I'm doing with the organization I'm working with at the moment, in terms of the headquarters requires certain positions, which will not exist in the new organization later this year. And so we need to make these links in a way that as if they do exist, so they can answer the questions that the experts are expected to answer who don't sit in that position anymore. And that's how you have to manage it at the moment. You find ways around it. And you try not to be deceitful. You try to be open in how you do it. At the same time, make sure it's robust enough so that they feel comfortable that you're doing it in that way.
And I see the biggest people that are going to have the hardest time is the legal departments of larger organizations. As far as, well, wait a minute, if we do this, what are the implications? And are we exposing ourselves for risk? And maybe I'll back up on that conversation because I think it'll be difficult. I think the change in mindset is difficult for a lot of people just because it's really different than the way we're used to working.
Yeah.
But a lot of people will find more engagement too. Perhaps the people who are in control now will have more, trouble letting go of control. How about that?
But there's a very interesting interview with one of the bosses, one of the managers in Netflix. Now, Netflix is a very interesting organization, and they have all sorts of boundaries with open source software, secret software. Their competitors, they sit on Amazon's platform, which is a competitor in their business as well. So there are many, many difficult boundaries with Netflix. And what she was saying, and she's the head of all the tools, the technical tools they use. And what she was saying about the legal side is their legal people are very supportive. They never find problems. They help them find ways of doing what they want to do in a safe way. And that's the culture of Netflix. They are all working collaboratively to ensure that the system works as it's needed to achieve the outcomes they're looking for. And if you're interested, it's I think a very interesting discussion. I use it with my technical students. So the first part is probably a bit boring for most people because it's about different software, open source and all this, but there are some nuggets buried in it that are very important for us to learn from on an organizational perspective. And so if you're interested, I'll put the link there. Yeah,
be delighted. Yeah, absolutely delighted.
Because I think they're an excellent example of how to work, because they have no processes. Now, bearing in mind, this is a technical company. They have no processes. They have no real boundaries. Each part has some outcome responsibilities, and they only survive because they collaborate. Because they don't
I'd argue that they do have processes, but no formal processes. None of these top-down QA.
There are no written processes. You have sort of behaviors that become the norm way of doing things, which you could argue is a process.
Oh, well, if you've got a backlog and an agile queue, that's a process. It's a process.
Yeah.
But I know what you mean. It's not
in
like
the sense of
design,
processes. There's no value chain process. Yeah. It is purely a collaborative approach, and their relationship with Microsoft, Amazon, and all the other big organizations is crucial for, and this comes back to what you were saying, Ross, about systems, the external systems and networks of different organizations. If they didn't have those relationships, they couldn't survive. Equally, Microsoft and the others would find it difficult as well. So they all rely on each other now. And I think they're a very good example of where the emerging organizations on the big scale are managing to survive. And that's not a hierarchical approach.
Hey, Jen, I'll just sort of add to that a little bit. You know, you worried about risk and being a barrier. So I'm working at a pretty high level of a very large bank. And banks have they got after the financial meltdown a decade ago, they're under extreme regulation. So if they don't do certain things, they're going to get fined, you know, millions or if not billions of dollars. Now they see their old way of working as more of a way of risk of not being able to hit these drop dead targets. And they've had to go to much more adaptive, much more distributed decision making, much more collaborative, much more agile ways of working in order to be compliant with the regulators, which is a really interesting twist. And this is happening so now they are seeing that their old way of working is more of a risk than this new agile, collaborative, fluid, whatever you want to call it, ecosystem way of working. So there you go.
John, in terms of that risk, how did they link this this new legislation and stuff together with the emerging new banks like Apple and all the others? Because banks in Europe have been really scared by this because they see them losing a real big chunk of their business.
Yeah, so so there's the risk of regulation compliance. There's also risk of losing market share, and there are words that I wish I could share you, but I've got NDAs that I'm not even allowed to dream about their business. But you know, things like saying if we don't do this, we won't have a bank in a few years' time. It's that level of top down.
Absolutely.
We have got to make this happen, and we got to do it at you know, what's the blitzkrieg speed? You know, we got to do it quickly.
Yeah.
And this, I'm just working for one, and they see themselves as behind the eight ball. I've also got another similar sized bank in Singapore, which I do some consulting for. They were ahead of the curve a bit. They've already sort of made that transition. But these guys, in terms of risk, they know that in a fast moving dynamic environment, old ways of processing, old ways of working are a bigger risk than embracing this new, you know, somewhat to a traditional manager, it seems very hard to let go of control. But the paradigm is shifting, and it's shifting really quickly.
I really support this because they're moving more to an effectuation approach that Ross and I have been talking about for a long time, and that you look at risk instead of how do we get rid of it and all the other stuff, but what can we afford to lose in this decision? Yeah, which is a very different mindset, isn't it? Really different mindset. Yeah.
Okay. Talking about risk and the legal, years ago, I was involved with a lot of new business arrangements and would be a point person for a number of contract negotiations. And we would always be routing contracts back and forth between the parties and have our legal department review it. But invariably, our legal department would pick up on little things that had a near zero probability of occurring. And they would be writing clauses in to address those, you know, really obscure issues that could pop up, while at the same time missing the big business issues that could cost us millions of dollars. You know, they're so focused on the small things that they're totally worthless for the most part of what they should have been doing.
This is very true. In the yeah, I can say it. When you're doing business with the Chinese, is a good example here. If you miss some of the clauses in their contracts, they will own your business before you even realize you've woken up for breakfast.
Wow.
They are amazing. You have to be really careful, really, really careful. I mean, and this is not just at the business level, it's at the national level, as we're finding now with all these roads and everything that they're giving countries and loans.
Oh, yeah.
And they're likely to actually take over those countries very quickly, which is why India is not very popular with China, apart from their border issue, is because India has economically saved 3 of their boundary countries from Chinese who they owed a lot of money to. And because India have come to their rescue, the Chinese are really doing everything now to sabotage India. So this business of looking at clauses at varying scales, you have to be really, really careful what the penalties are. Yeah.
Nice.
And they never stop negotiating either, even though you've signed the contracts. Are amazing. I've spent so many years working with them that and truth means something different. They don't tell lies, they just tell you what they think you want to hear.
Yeah.
Fascinating country, fascinating, love it. Okay, I'm gonna have to go soon.
Okay.
How's your HR project going?
We are, and Adriana, jump in at any time. I think we have a direction for the presentation. So it's still in preliminary stages, but we talked about our different options, and then we wanted to run it by you. We thought about using actually my dad's situation as a case study.
Oh yeah, okay. That's quite a nice one actually, yeah.
Yeah, and John, he's retired now, but my dad worked for over 35 years for a utilities company. And so I grew up hearing stories about his experiences. So we thought I just put together a slide. Right now it highlights, I can share a screen. Right now it just highlights the element of that my dad compared his job to. There was a commercial of the Maytag repairman. I'm not sure what era that was, where he was just sitting at a desk drinking coffee, waiting for calls to come in. And then when a call came in, then he'd jump up and run and go repair the equipment. And that's really what my dad's role was, is a lot of time is spent in the control room interfacing with the systems that operate the turbines and these, in a power plant. But most of the time is spent doing some, they check the numbers every hour, but most of it is just sitting, waiting for an emergency to happen. And so they've all come up with creative ways to use their time during the time. So I can share my screen real quick and see what you think, because this is just something that I put together really quick.
You have the ability to share your screen.
I don't know if I do actually.
Check in the bottom.
Someone's gonna give you permission.
Yeah, I gave a co-host position.
Okay.
You should have at the bottom of your screen a share screen with green.
I've got host disabled participant screen sharing, right?
Yeah, Jen, you should be
Okay.
at the bottom. You ever see a share screen center your bottom?
I do.
Okay.
Let's see. And it said, let's see.
There you go.
Okay. You
Yep,
see?
yep,
Ignore
you're
the
there.
messiness. Okay, so this is Adriana, we had talked about a title when I was putting it on the screens. It seemed really long, so I kind of let's see here. File format. Now I'm trying to remember how to do the slideshow. Okay. So right now we just have 2 slides. Okay, so this was a case study as just a draft. So it really highlighted, and I changed the names. My dad's name is Ron. But most of his time he studied on the side, the financial markets and the stocks. So that's what he enjoyed doing for years and years. And he would go to his different stocks on the web, but the company locked down on what they could look at on their computer screen. So he was no longer able to do that. So he started bringing in books. So that's how he spends his time. Another liked to watch movies. So he actually brought in a home entertainment system in the control room. And then when the company got word of that, they locked down and had him remove it. And then another person liked to sleep on the job, so he brought in a cot. So, and there's other elements that the guys tend to resort to. It's based on seniority, and I'm not sure if to include this in the case study or not. I'm hoping to get your guys' input, but it was based on seniority. So they would try to use bullying. At one point, my dad's car was damaged in the parking lot to try to get rid of people who were higher up on the seniority of them. And they'd use other tactics to try to control each other. And really after talking with Dr. Butterfield, it seemed like the problem was a lack of engagement. And then they have a headquarters, and they have consultants that come on periodically. So they would launch these programs, and then they'd expect the guys to comply with the programs. And so the mentality really was, well, we'll just wait until the next one. We'll do what they say, and then we'll wait. But they really weren't engaged. They were there to get their pensions. So Adriana and I just thought, we believe part of the problem lies in the organizational focus on control versus around the work. So then the question was, how do we meet the outcomes of this role in a way that focus on the work rather than controlling the employees or environment? So I don't know, what do you guys think about this approach? So we took out HR, thinking that if we talk about what the outcomes are, then HR would probably come up in the conversation, or maybe it wouldn't.
Ross?
I like what you're doing. You could probably approach it from an operations point of view, but then also overlay that from the different HR processes to see which processes that may be encouraging the current situations and which one would have to be modified to allow a change in approach to the work itself. So I think there's, you got some interesting points of view there from the operations as well as from the HR side.
Okay. I'm not sure I'm following as far as the HR processes.
Well, okay. So for example, what are the policy procedures for, time on the job, the issues of seniority, the issues of pay and bonuses, the issues of maybe development, what exactly is their role?
Oh, okay. So flesh that out for the audience. Okay.
Yeah. So for example, in this particular case, is their role to be engaged doing something for the benefit of the company, or is their role to be there waiting for an emergency to happen?
Well, ultimately, the role prevents operational failures.
Yeah.
So it's really for
Right.
them to step in if the system goes down, and to problem solve how to get the systems running again.
Right. Okay. In which case, is there a role then for preventing or to come up with ways to foresee problems? It sounds like that's not one of their expectations.
That's a great question. I can ask. I don't think so.
Yeah. So in which case they're there to respond to when the problem occurs, but to what extent are they being given any responsibility to reflect on what has happened, why it happened, and is there something in the process or in the engineering itself that could have been foreseen? It's a very different use of their spare time, but it's also giving them probably a little bit more responsibility that somebody probably at a staff organization currently holds.
Well, the interesting thing is they just replaced all the systems with new turbines. And when they built the interface, they created duplicates. So there's one in Minneapolis, and then there's one in the control room. So there's two teams monitoring these systems. So, so that's another element that is interesting. And I believe that he said it was because of the warranty of the company. The manufacturer wouldn't cover it unless they had this extra monitoring in place. But as far as the risks, that sounds like that's kind of what the experience and the knowledge of the job. So if my dad looked at these, he had the engineering understanding of, okay, this level goes up, that's indicative of this is a possibility that could happen. But I'm not sure of to the level of what you were talking about.
Yeah, I'm going deeper, but the issue of dual control rooms raises other operational issues of what happens when there is an issue. How do they communicate, and who takes the lead if you've got two control rooms that are capable of reacting? I mean, that could have some real risks associated with it.
Other question to add to that would be, so this second control room, are those people sitting there in the downtime watching movies, taking naps, or doing?
Who watches the watches?
Yeah. It's like you create a whole nother control room with these same problems.
Yeah.
I just suggest you don't get too complicated here. John, I think this is exception reporting and activity as opposed to preemptive maintenance and monitoring. Right. What do you say?
I'd say so. Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe that if you can get from your father what their real purpose of being there and why there were so many people. Was it complex enough to need so many people all the time, so that you get an idea of what the job really entailed? And then try and align that with the classic way of HR treating these types of jobs. So what were they looking for in the people who were in there? It sounds to me as though you have sort of 2 or 3 people who are highly motivated to do something of value. The job wasn't giving them that, so they were doing other things like your father doing the market and things like this. So they have this intrinsic motivation to do something of value. And so are they overqualified for the job? All those sorts of questions, and try and make sense of the situation as it was and how it could be different, using a different approach to analyzing the work as opposed to mitigating the risk, which is what I see as the two differences here.
Yeah, you've got another issue of the changing technology also, in which case, is there some redundancy of having people on site because they physically had to run and turn a valve or switch something there physically, versus the new technology that has not only a control room there, but a remote control room that people are no longer actually needing to be on site physically to do what may need to be done.
Right, because there's different layers. There's maintenance crews. There's different crews that are in the plant at the same time. Well, and the interesting is they tried to fill their time with, they eliminated a lot of the supervisors. So the scheduling and the supervisor roles kind of fell on to different people, which actually became kind of a resentment because they're asking them to do 2 jobs in the one. But, and also maintenance of cleaning the facilities. So that's how, I guess that's how HR kind of came by trying to fill the time.
Yeah, I think it's also another example of, if you get the people design what the work was necessary to achieve this outcome, you would have come up with different conclusions.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That's a really good point. And I was also thinking about the whole saluted Genesis approach. So you've got people bored out of their bloody brains because they're, you know, and so what can you do, which is going to keep those minds and bodies activated, but still, you know, they're still there to respond to a red light or an alarm or whatever they have to do there. But yeah, it's absolute problem with work design.
It's the classic.
So how do we spark discussion? Because that's really the purpose of all of this is so I can build out more description about what it is, and then how do we engage the description and really moving and really facilitating that move from, organizing for risk or focus on risk, and then focus on the work and allowing the workers to come up with these processes. What do you suggest?
You could
Sorry
probably,
about that.
Ask the question, but I'm not sure that it starts the conversation.
go ahead, Reg.
Sorry, I didn't hear the question because I just had to answer a quick phone
Okay.
call. Just a comment from my side. I think you've got a wonderful case here for looking at how work is classified and people are motivated. I think if you stick to one or two themes only, and these are just two examples, there are others you could do, but for example, as John and I was mentioning just now, that if the people who are going to do this work actually together with whoever's responsible for saying yes or no, design the work itself. And if you remember the other day when we were talking about the scheduling, they resented it, but if they would give them the task together to do it, then maybe that would have been a different outcome. And the other side is that the behavior of management was about control by stopping them doing things rather than working with them on improving their engagement, which is so often in motivation is or performance management is more and more about compliance rather than engagement and motivation. And I think there are two areas where you could have a good discussion going.
Okay.
Yeah. You could also think about having it as a layered case study too.
Yeah.
Where you present maybe just the basics itself and open up for comments, and then have a series of supplemental slides that adds maybe a little bit different detail to it, or a different problem that's occurred in the past. So for example, the addition of a second control room, that's adding another level of detail that opens up other questions, but then also have a series of slides you can introduce whenever the conversation starts to slow down, asking different questions from different perspectives. So for example, from an HR policy standpoint, or from a seniority standpoint, or from a work responsibility development standpoint, from the standpoint of a job description, expectations, and the requirements to fulfill the job. I mean, you could come at it from different points of view and keep layering more detail and questions into the case study.
Yeah, no, I support that.
Yeah.
And I know this is your first draft, but
Yeah.
when you actually do your final slides, I suggest that you don't have a fraction of the detail that you've got on here.
Yeah, get rid of text.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just have bullet points. Because otherwise, you're talking and I'm trying to read the case study,
Yep.
Yeah.
and I didn't read the case study. I didn't hear what you were saying. So it was just
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. That's so great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
Put
if
a
you are
contextual
going to
picture.
have if you are going to have text on it, read that text out to us,
Okay.
so we don't have to parallel process. Yeah.
Yeah.
The key is just use a couple keywords that cues you relative to what you want to say, and just
Yeah.
provide the text as a voiceover.
Yeah,
Okay.
and you can have a picture of a book, of someone on a couch, and what else was there? A TV room. You just use visuals to support your story.
Yeah. Or a control room or whatever. Put it in the context of what you're talking about.
Okay.
Yeah, but go ahead and have a few words here and there, and use the words then to really outline what you want to say.
Okay.
Good. No, it's coming together nicely.
Yeah, looks good.
Okay.
I'm
Adriana,
going to
do
have
you-
to go, folks, because
Yeah,
my
me too,
client
mate.
was on the phone. I should have an appointment I rearranged for today. So I'm going to have a go. Good luck. Look forward to the next iteration.
Yep.
And speak to you all soon.
And I've got to go too. So good night, guys. See you later.
Excellent, excellent.
Cheers.
Okay.
Bye.
All right. Okay, any other closing comments? Let me see here.
Jen, I think we could maybe like chat offline in the chat a little bit more if you want to continue talking about the project.
Sure.
Sound
Okay.
good?
Yeah, and Indiana, your microphone volume is low today for some reason.
For me?
Yes. At least,
Oh.
at least I'm having a hard time hearing you versus hearing others.
Oh, okay. I might not be close enough. I might be
Ah.
kind of far away. Is that
Okay.
a little better?
A little bit, but not as good as it was the other day.
Okay. I'll have to check and see if there's a problem.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. How did you want to chat, Adriana? Did you want to just do it on the Futocracy chat? Or do you want to hop on a Zoom call? I could forward you a link.
Yeah, we could hop on a Zoom call.
Okay. Okay. Thanks, Ross.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for
Okay.
joining. And I guess everyone have a good day and we'll connect next Thursday then.
Okay.
All right.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.